I would like to introduce our first education champion, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond. She is the president of the State Board of Education for California. She is also the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University and founding president of the Learning Policy Institute. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you, Jacinia. It's great to be here. I'm delighted to be here in this very hopeful moment. As you have described, it's a moment where we can begin to address the inequalities that have long been part of our education system and our state, and reinvent education. As you noted, the governor has just proposed a historic budget, in all about $20 billion for education, around a whole child, whole community vision for our educational system. We see in this vision schools, including early learning settings and preschools, as a hub of a family-centered community, and the primary tool that government has to alleviate the negative impacts of child poverty. In addition to being the balance wheel of the social machinery, as it was called by Horace Mann, public schools where children spend the majority of their lives outside of their own home. By re-envisioning the K-12 educational experience, in fact, the TK, in fact, the early learning through K-12 educational experience, now we have an on-ramp to be much more holistic. The state can improve the outcomes for young Californians. This is the vision that inspires that budget. A child arrives at his or her local community school, is greeted by caring adults. The child feels safe and is engaged in surroundings that are supportive. A nutritious breakfast is available if the child is hungry. The child has a well-prepared, culturally competent, emotionally responsive teacher who has the necessary support in the classroom to teach in a manner that is responsive to the needs of each child, and is focused on exciting, engaging, inquiry-based instruction that connects to children's experiences. After a productive instructional day and a healthy lunch, the child has the opportunity to participate in enriching activities, perhaps the STEM club, some music lessons, sports practice, or art class. Some of these may be offered by local community-based organizations, complete with snacks. The child may experience targeted tutoring during or after the school day. Will have access to additional supports, counselors, nurses, social workers who make sure that the child's health, mental health, and other needs are being met. Parents are invited in through parent student teacher conferencing, through home visits, through participation in the life of the school. And the child's life is organized in a way that is supportive in every imaginable respect. That's the vision that motivates all the separate little programs that you will hear about and are no doubt advocating around in the process of developing this budget. Of course, the picture I just described is not the reality in the state's public schools as a whole at the moment. And to address the discrepancies, the budget does do a number of things. It increases and rebenches LCFF to allow for universal TK for all 4-year-olds and for greater concentration grant funding. There's expanded access, of course, to early childhood education as children enter the school system. As you know, in California, our public education system actually advances children's learning at a rate that is greater than that in most other states. But kids come to school further behind with greater inequalities because of the lack of a system of early childhood experiences. The master plan that was released earlier this year that we need to attend to as we build an entire system of early learning from birth through age 4, 5, and beyond needs to motivate not only these current investments, but the investments that are yet to come. The third piece of this is both a greater investment in teachers, improved preparation and training, investments in the pipeline of teachers, both for early childhood and for K through 12 in shortage areas, through residencies, through classified staff supports, through Golden State scholarships, and through rewards or incentives for National Board certified accomplished teachers by the thousands to be supported to mentor other teachers in high poverty schools, which routinely have a parade of underprepared teachers who come and go at a very rapid rate. And the kind of continuity we need, the kind of support we need for teachers in those schools to create a positive, stable, constructive learning environment requires us attracting and keeping experienced, accomplished teachers in those places as well. There are, of course, the investments for full service community schools intended to go to all of the state's high poverty schools, those with more than 80% of students in poverty. That's more than a third of the state schools. So it's a very substantial commitment, organized in ways that counties and districts can orchestrate the services to be sure that they are readily available in those schools, and network schools so that they can learn from one another. The year-round access to enrichment activities and extended day supplemental education programs is part of increased access to school-wide nutrition programs, the increased presence of adults on campus with additional staffing to include counselors, social workers, and nurses, improved and more seamless relationship between schools and managed health care plans, county health, and social services, and greater student access to broadband internet and computer technology, both in the classroom and at home. And this is a place where we've seen how when necessity presents itself, they say necessity is the mother of invention, we can rapidly change the way we do business. When the pandemic hit a year ago, at least a third of our students did not have the connectivity and devices at home that would allow them to engage in instruction. We have cut that digital divide by at least 2/3. The broadband infrastructure that's needed both in cities and rural areas is now on the table to be completed and constructed if the budget proceeds forward. And we are at a point where we should not return, as Justinia said, to the old normal, where once again, a third of the students don't have those devices and connectivity at home. We need to push forward to completely close that digital divide so that all of our children have a chance to become proficient in technology, to use it for all the varied purposes of learning and living for which it is so necessary both for families and for children, and to be part of the high-tech jobs of the future rather than closed off from that part of the economy. So that's just one example of the many ways in which we need to take advantage of what we've accomplished and learned during the pandemic and carry it forward into a new system. Of course, all that I've described is not a given. The Legislative Analyst's Office put out its report this week and advises the state to think small rather than to think big about the possibilities for transforming the system. And so all of these things will be contended, and it will be important for voices to be heard on what we value and need for the education system that we deserve. In the 1970s, California was the undisputed leader in education in the country, and the United States was the undisputed leader of education in the world. That has changed dramatically. There was a point where California was rated 48th or 49th among all the states in education before LCFF came in. You know, we are rebuilding, we are reorienting, but we have a long way to go to provide all the features of an educational system that our children need and deserve. So we're going to have to continue to put the pedal to the metal, as they say, in this process. In addition to what I just described, federal funding is about to enter California to the tune of $23 billion from the American Rescue Plan Act. That's on top of the investments from the CARES Act and the December Recovery Act that was enacted. And it's very important for all of us to think about the investments of these monies in a long-term systemic way. We don't want to use this money in a way that throws paint at the wall and gets, you know, a bunch of shiny objects to happen in the moment, and then we're left with a raggedy system that still does not take and make routine and readily available all the elements of the education that we need. So I think it's important to prioritize the most important elements of building that system. I'll suggest 3 of them right now. One is that we need, for once and for all, to solve and end the shortages of teachers and school leaders in this state that have been plaguing us on and off for decades, but very severely since 2015. That can be done. Other states have done it. The investments that I described are thought about over a 5-year period to plant a routine set of supports that will live on. And that includes, the kinds of residency programs that train teachers well, have high retention rates, bring them in and keep them in the classroom, provide the induction as well as the initial training. Similarly for school leaders, similarly the kinds of scholarships and forgivable loans that allow people to enter this profession without debt so that they can afford to stay in the profession. Those elements of building a system for caring, competent, qualified teachers need to be thought of as something that's a continuous process. Districts can use their money for these purposes. They can match the money that the state is providing for residencies. They can build sustainable pathways with their higher education partners, and those should live on over the coming years so that we become a state that looks a lot more like Finland, where every teacher gets strong preparation in a master's degree program and a professional development model teaching school where they learn best practices and stays in the profession for their lifetime, because they are also supported by good working conditions, by the supports for learning that allow them to be effective. The second area that I think we should be building a system in is with respect to community schools, which are so important, because one of the things community schools do, as all these other funds are coming in for health and mental health and social services and the things that President Biden as well as Governor Newsom sees are needed. But if we don't have a way to sort of organize those resources, make them readily available to children and families so that people don't have to go out and stand in line and fight your bureaucratic forms and impediments and barriers to get access to the services, that money will go to waste. So we need the wraparound focus that integrates all of the resources and points them at the needs of children and families in very supportive, personalized, relational ways. And that's what we know community schools do. Again, we need to plant that so that we have, as we do in the budget proposals, at least a 5-year ramp to get virtually all of our high poverty schools organized in this way in a learning community with each other to learn. And then beyond that, we need local districts to be thinking about this as well when their federal money comes in, how to use that money to create that kind of community school environment in as many schools as they can, putting the federal and the state money together. And finally, we need to really focus on a productive learning framework. And I'll just say a word about that framework very quickly. Obviously, I mentioned the early learning piece of that framework, which is so important and needs to be developmentally important, developmentally appropriate, and surround children with supports, with linguistically and culturally competent teachers, with opportunities for inquiry and joyful engagement with others. As children learn by doing, they need those opportunities to do that kind of early learning work in rich, supportive environments. Hopefully, as we build this system, we do it in a more racially and linguistically and economically integrated way because we're taking a universal approach, and we do that throughout the system. The other piece is that we need to think about a new approach to learning that accelerates learning rather than taking the old framework that was put in place when our factory model schools were invented in the early 1900s. That framework came into being to sort of stamp students with standardized approaches to lessons, to rank and sort them into, above, at, and below average, and put them in different tracks. This was happening at the same time that the eugenics movement was very much alive, well, and guiding the thinking of educational innovators of that time. And we've learned a lot about what does and doesn't work about that system that it is now time to move from. As we said in the Learning Policy Institute's Restarting and Reinventing Schools, it's important not to return to that old normal that Justinia mentioned, but to a new normal that's grounded in what we know from the science of learning and development. If we really want to support learning, the return to school should not include these staple features of an outdated approach to learning that research has found actually undermine achievement. Testing students to label and track them into the high, average, and low groups that are segregated by perceived ability and often by race, class, and language background as well. Offering regimented drill and kill remedial instruction, which slows down learning in these segregated groups, focused on filling gaps in basic skills in the artificial ways that they are assessed on multiple choice tests, which then often causes them to be taught in equally artificial ways that do not travel and transfer to other areas of performance. Personalizing, in quotes, learning by putting students in front of programmed computers for machine-based instruction for long hours at a time, or piles of worksheets that offer the same decontextualized approach to learning. Punishing students who disengage or express frustration and despair by excluding them from the classroom, or removing so-called privileges like recess and library time, or placing the neediest students in remedial classes with the least trained and experienced teachers who are the least likely to know how to create productive learning environments. Instead, a supportive school return, both this summer and this fall, should seek to ensure that students experience warm relationships and social emotional supports that are achieved by redesigning schools so that they are relationship centered, with built-in time for creating community and trust and belonging among students and with families, with time for those home visits and positive phone calls home, for those meetings between family members and teachers. With restructured high schools that always have small learning communities and advisories where small groups of students are part of a family group with a teacher who is connected to the family and is an advocate for the teacher. It's time for us to learn from the redesigned schools we already have how to create the relationship-centered structures that are needed for people to care. Restorative practices are, of course, a part of that environment because the relationships are so strong. We should be engaging in outdoor play and exercise and expressive arts and collaborative activities, all of which actually support brain development as well as learning. And we should be doing that with our community partners. We should see that students encounter culturally responsive and authentic learning tasks and inquiry projects that are connected to their experiences and allow them to understand and positively impact their environment. We should assess what students need, both socially and emotionally, as well as academically, and address trauma with healing and support, and identify the next steps that students are ready to take in their learning rather than labeling them. There's a long literature in research about how if you find where students are in their next effort to learn, students are always motivated by learning the next thing they're ready to learn. They are not motivated by being labeled and stigmatized and told that they are below or not ready or behind in their learning. So we have to be very careful not to use a learning loss language that doesn't recognize what children have been learning this year. It may not always be the standard school curriculum, but children are always learning. They have assets, they have knowledge bases and funds of knowledge on which we can build. And when we find out exactly where they are and tailor the learning to their needs, which can be done with the investments in high intensity tutoring that also are part of the budget, then we see very dramatic, steep gains in learning, as well as in confidence and a sense of competence that drives the growth mindset that keeps children on track to graduate and succeed in life. So this work should start right away and continue into the summer and next year. Summer school should not be a boot camp for children who are, quote, behind. Instead, of course, the studies find the most effective models provide rich opportunities for play and enrichment. In fact, the RAND Corporation found that summer programs that include enrichment with arts and sports and other engaging activities get higher gains in achievement than summer programs that are only focused on often drill and kill, but academic tasks exclusively. So we should look to find strategies like Cajon Valley schools are engaging in, and Camp Cajon is what they call their summer enrichment program. Many places are partnering with community-based organizations. Tulsa is planning this summer with partners ranging from YMCA to Tulsa's Bike Club to Global Gardens and Reading Partners and Debate League and more, and create highly engaging opportunities that mix that recreation with learning. And finally, we should remember that the opportunity to contribute is highly motivating for students and actually supports recovery from trauma by engaging in projects that allow students to grow and improve things, from school and community gardens and murals that feed and beautify, to a range of school, classroom, or community improvement projects that show students their strengths and produce a sense of accomplishment and agency as they advance growth and well-being for themselves and others. If we focus only on learning loss right now, we will walk down a familiar road that is paved with repetitive remediation, disengaged students, and reluctant families who are disillusioned with impersonal and inauthentic learning. Beginning with this summer and continuing into the next academic year, we need to restructure schooling to support trust within supportive classrooms that don't ignore the trauma of the pandemic, but respond to it with healing, with engagement, with attachment, and with supports. If we do this, we can get learning gains that far exceed the old normal and set the norm for a new age in education that builds on how children really learn rather than working against it. I look forward to working with all of you to bring that reality into being and to be sure that our children, as John Dewey put it, get what the best and wisest parent wants for his or her child. As he said, that is what the community must want for all of its children. Any other goal is narrow and unlovely, and acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Only by being true to the full growth of all the individuals who make it up can society by any chance be true to itself. I think that is our mission, and we have a wonderful jumping off point at this moment to really bring that into reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda Darling-Hammond. We did have one question. I'm not sure if you'd be open to answering. What is California going to do to increase the representation of teachers of color to better reflect the student population?
That's a great question. We right now do better than many other states, but we have still gains to make. In California, about 30% of teachers are people of color, and about 50% of incoming teachers are candidates of color. But a part of our challenge is to keep those people in the classroom because our attrition rates are very high. So one of the things we need to do is bring people into teaching in ways that acknowledge the needs for supports. The debt load that candidates of color carry is about twice as high as the debt load of candidates from white communities, where the family income base is typically much higher. So the Golden State Scholarships will offer candidates who want to teach in high need schools up to $20,000 to go into teaching as long as they stay in teaching for several years. Those will, we've seen from other studies, disproportionately support candidates of color for coming into teaching. and the residency models that I mentioned, which support people in the communities. Usually these are in high need urban and rural communities, which underwrite the tuition, provide some stipends for living, some kind of a salary, and provide the top quality training and induction that people need, are disproportionately candidates of color. The one in San Francisco is about 2/3 candidates of color, and they stay in teaching at rates of 90% usually. And so we can then stem the attrition that is what causes us to lose so many of our teachers of color in the state. We want to bring people in, we want to bring them in the very best, most supportive way possible, give them the very best training that's available, and then keep them because they're also getting the induction and the supports and the wraparound that's needed to be a long-term leader in the profession. So it's a very important part of the agenda. And we have a number of programs that can make a huge difference if they get through the budget process in the coming weeks.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. A lot of folks have found your comments and your presence here today really valuable. So thank you again for joining our virtual water cooler series. I specifically appreciated your overview on specific and additional support students can look forward to as they return to in-person, how we can address the shortages of teachers, also community schools, right, with an equity lens, that the budget is intended to go to 1/3 of the schools in the state with high poverty level. And ultimately, really appreciate your support for the new approach to learning to ensure that we're not going to our old normal of doing things.